Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with Caleb for the fourth time, but the 10th chapter, The Value of Saintliness by William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience. And we were just saying, this has got to be the best chapter so far. It is very interesting. And he gets, the beginning of the chapter is much more him letting us know what he's doing and how he's approaching these questions, and the rest is him approaching the questions, and they fit together so well. So
yeah,
let's get into it. How does he start out?
So he goes back to the idea that he kind of brought up in the last chapter of testing human values or the nature of something by judging its fruits. So he's talking about understanding or judging religion based on the fruits that it develops in people. And so he, like, kind of from the get-go, like, understands that this is not going to be like super clear-cut, formulaic, like axiomatic, because it's like you're looking at empirical results. So there's some like fuzziness. There's some times where it's not always clear. So as Adam Smith would like to say, there'd be some loose, vague, and indeterminacy. But by and large, you can still pull away good principles or decent results out of it, even though it might not be perfectly clear.
Yeah. And he gets into this is a really good section too, because that's like the typical standard with pragmatism or radical empiricism or just James philosophy in general. But then people will always ask, like, oh, so the truth is what's useful. Oh, so I can just believe that everything is like as I want it to be? No, that's not exactly how it works. And he kind of gets into it here. And it in a sense, he gets more accurate of what he means by useful and what our standards for use are really worked out in this section. Yeah. So I think this stuff that he's doing here is relevant to the pragmatism stuff later on. It's almost like him in doing pragmatism in the lab. That's the way you can think of it.
Did he do this before pragmatism?
He did this before the formal lecture series called Pragmatism, but it's certainly not before he was doing these kinds of ideas. And the essays in The Will to Believe are a little bit similar. He was really calling himself more radical empiricist at the time, but I think the word pragmatism was floating around. It's not clear. I'm not sure. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Oh no, that's it.
Okay. Then he goes on about talking about how reality of God has to be judged, and his reality and nature affects whether an action is fruitful or not. So he talks about the example of like animal sacrifices, and so back then, in ancient times, that would be seemed as something that would be normal for a god to demand, and it would be something that people then would consider fruitful and good that would come from it. But nowadays, people would see that as being barbaric or cruel, and so they might even reject evidence that points to a belief in a god like that, because the action that is seen as like propriety in that situation is so like repulsive to them now. So so you can believe or disbelieve in a god based on like what actions are deemed fruitful by that belief. And then he kind of goes into the normal critique of, disbelieving in God or a certain type of God is also a theological belief. So whenever you're talking about belief or disbelief of, of God or a spiritual entity, you're dealing with a theological belief. And so people will believe or disbelieve based on the fruits, and those are theological judgments.
And the disbelieving, as an activity is something that's really big in The Will to Believe, obviously, but also in his other essay called Is Life Worth Living, which I'm making a video on soon, which is kind of like a corollary in a way to The Will to Believe. And where disbelieving in something is just as much of an action because it's just as much of a risk as a belief. Because people think, oh, I'm not going to believe this because I don't want to risk believing something stupid, right? But not believing something is just as much taking a risk. So you're kind of in a situation where you need to take a risk in one direction. We need to gamble on something, even if it's not a gamble, if it's a real sense of assurance, you know, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to go one way or the other. They both have their own sets of consequences. That has to be recognized.
Yeah.
Disbelief and belief. And and now, is this the section where he gets into, I guess that's the next section, where he goes, essentially, when he kind of talks like what we believe forms the gods that, like the reality of God. And I don't think that's exactly, he phrases it in ways that's very tricky and we need to work out properly, you know?
Yeah.
Like we don't need to just jump in, because someone could easily jump in and just say like, oh, well, people just, you know, believe whatever's relevant to them and God is like a metaphor for it. Somebody could read this and read that into it, right? But he's been very clear in this and earlier chapters that he doesn't want to deny God's reality, even in the traditional sense that it's understood.
Yeah.
Right? But he just wants to describe more specifically the relationship of experiencing these things and how these play themselves out over time as well, especially. And actually not especially. That's kind of what he leaves open, how these things play out themselves out over time. And that's where the econ and the political stuff gets involved.
Yeah.
The political side of religion, which is interesting too, which we'll get into. And yeah, so the next part is about, he titles it Unfit Religions Get Eliminated by Experience, which are both in quotes. Unfit is in quotes and experience is in quotes.
Yeah, there's a good quote that kind of highlights the thing that you really need to parse out. It's when we cease to admire or approve what the definition of a deity implies, we end up deeming that deity incredible. So it's kind of that a statement like that can lead to seeing James as implying that God is just a metaphor kind of deal, where he just symbolizes the highest ideal of whatever a culture idealizes at that time and is amorphous and changes over time.
Yeah. Like the example that he gives is, we think of God differently today than we would in the past because we hold like democracy as these high values in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And so we're willing to dethrone God.
Yeah.
Right. Like in a sense, this plays into a lot of things in that a lot of people will, if they, like Nietzsche, for example, in some sense, wasn't really that concerned with the metaphysics of like God and whether or not he existed or anything like that. It was much more like, oh, well, Christians are weak people and I don't approve of their weakness.
Yeah.
So he, in a sense, when these gods fall, it just means no one is worshiping them. Is that what James means? It's not clear. I wish it was clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. And unfit religions does not necessarily mean religions that should not be followed precisely. It almost means religions that cannot be followed in some way.
Yeah. Like whatever the culture or belief at the time is so different or repulsed by the fruits that a religion would bring that it's like unpalatable for someone to actually carry out.
But remember, when he uses the word unfit, he's meaning it in Darwinian terms. So he means like environmental fitness.
So it won't survive, that kind of
deal? Like a religion won't serve it. Like there is no soil that is good soil for that word. In a way. in a sense.
even if it's true in a sense, like if there existed a God that had that demanded worship in a certain way that could not find fit soil, then even though that God like ontologically exists, it would still be an unfit religion to follow it then.
Mm-hmm. And like if it was a God that demanded that we have wings or something, I guess James is kind of saying like just humans wouldn't worship it. They
Yeah.
can't really enter into a relationship with that God, so the religion would not exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And okay, then he says this thing about Luther. He says, Emerson says, Luther would have cut off his right hand rather than nail his theses to the door of Wittenberg if he had supposed that they were destined to lead to the pale negations of Boston Unitarianism. And we sent this to our friend Logan. And wait, what did Logan say? Let me look it up. But we sent this to our friend Logan. Logan is a very strong Orthodox guy. And he said,
well, Lutheran guy.
Oh yeah. Sorry. And Logan said, the immense manly way, the truth, and the life.
No. That was to the other.
Oh, that was to the other quote. Okay.
The first one, the reply to this one was starting the new trend of cutting off your right hand to own the Unitarians. Who's with me?
Yeah. And then Dom said, as long as the left hand doesn't know what's happening, it's biblical. There you go, baby.
Boom.
There you go. Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. And so when he says like, oh, we use human experiences to judge gods, and then he keeps going like, I know what you're thinking, like, oh, well, but the truth might be completely unrelated. And he's saying, yeah, but understand the process of how experiences and how people learn and how people's religions form. That's what I'm trying to describe here. And people's values, and it's not so much just like, okay, well, we have our own human philosophies and values and stuff, and that's its own independent track. And then like theology is just like a thing on top of it where we just like make our gods like believe whatever we like, right?
Yeah.
And that the gods and the stories about the gods play back into the philosophies as well.
Yeah.
And like your actual relationship with the real world plays into what you believe and value and who your gods are, and then to the point that your gods and what you value become the same thing.
Yeah. And yeah, so you've got feedback between your philosophy and your theology. So like what you value philosophically is influenced by what you believe theologically, and your philosophical understandings of the world influence your theology. Like the Brett Salk video on PVK's channel, where he talks about the switch from Platonic philosophy to Aristotelian around the time of the Reformation, created that confusion around the idea of the Eucharist. And so you had splits in theology. You had consubstantiation and transubstantiation developed as different theology and doctrine, and they emerged out of just like different philosophical understandings. And so your philosophy definitely plays into your understanding of theology as well.
Yeah. And I'd want to know what, like, I'm thinking about, like, okay, God like talks to people at certain moments in history. These are what we'll call religious experiences. So like Moses going up on the mountain and coming back down with the 10 Commandments, that completely formed Jewish philosophy, legal theory, ethics, liturgical practices, all these kinds of things. And they're just kind of playing back and forth. So, and people clearly over time think different things about God. That's like not really all that controversial to say. Doesn't mean that there wasn't a truth behind the scenes the whole time. And it's very much a thing in Christianity, at least, to say that religion is revealed slowly over time. We don't, what he's calling like changes, we might just normally call revelations of the deeper truth.
Yeah, because it takes years and years to unpack everything, and then you're also like, as culture shifts underneath the theology, then your understanding of theology has to change as your culture changes as well. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got a lot of stuff that's just not stable. So we shouldn't expect, culture or philosophy to develop over time without it playing back into your understanding of theology as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he uses this phrase that religion does not subsist on, it does not rest on apodictic certainty, just meaning like absolute beyond a doubt certainty, which I'm down with.
Yeah. And I think that actually kind of is important understanding like the divide between like the new atheists and like Christian evangelical fundamentalists is they both buy into the idea of apodictic certainty for their theology. And so the atheists say, God does not meet up to our measure of certainty, so we reject God. We couldn't understand enough, or we don't know enough about him to be able to believe in him. And the fundamentalists, they rule out they read the Bible literally, and they put a lot of emphasis on faith over science because they want to have that apodictic certainty in their theology, and so they let everything else in their life kind of fall secondary to like their theology, because they want their theology to rest on something that isn't malleable or changing or open to interpretation. And so I think since they've both bought into that apodictic certainty, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and they miss out on some of the lack of certainty, but you can still learn a lot when you're in that more middle ground where you understand that there are things that are open to interpretation and things beyond just a strict understanding of the Bible or of religious text.
Yeah. And what was I going to say? Oh, the way that Paul Vanderklay talks about it is they're modernists. That's what the postmodernism is. Post that modern, but they're modernists in the sense of like Descartes, and their goal is not so much simply knowledge, but specifically certain knowledge.
Yeah.
And Descartes is very, very clear about that when he writes. And so I don't like Descartes. I'm not a fan. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he started talking a little bit more about empiricism. Yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about how empirical claims are subject to skeptical critique, but that doesn't mean that you have to like enter into wallowing into a sea of doubt. So you can still make claims with general certainty or relative certainty, even if they're not apodictic certainty. So what he's like saying is, we understand that there's some uncertainty in here, but that doesn't mean that you just throw it all away because you can't have a Cartesian proof of its validity, right? You want to have, you still open it up to like change and doubt, but it's still something that you can generally know.
And well, the way that he defines empiricism in the Will to Believe is it's you believe that you can know, but you can't know with 100% certainty when you do know. So empiricism, even though it admits that you can be skeptical about its conclusions, it doesn't claim certainty, but it does claim genuine knowledge.
Yeah.
And that you can have genuine knowledge by those means. It doesn't rule itself out. It's not self-destroying, self-critiquing.
Yeah.
As long as you do it the right way, right?
Yeah.
So that's basically what that's what Kant's critique of pure reason is. I haven't read it or gone into it at all, but that was what the big deal of Kant was he was like, because Kant read Hume and then he was like, geez, you really can be skeptical about everything. What the heck are we supposed to do? And then you went, oh, you just don't have to, you don't just have to do only that.
Yeah.
And you can do other things too with your time. And that's fine. You don't have to have certainty sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to have faith.
Yeah.
Okay, what is this quote that he has here? The mere outward form of inalterable certainty is so precious to some minds that to renounce it explicitly is for them out of the question. They will claim it even where the facts most patently pronounce its folly. Yeah, there you go. That's what he means. Yeah. And that again applies to atheists, and it applies to fundamentalists. And Ross Douthat on Twitter the other day was saying, I think it was him, was saying that he collects stories of atheists who have like something like a religious experience like would be in this book, and then just spend their time rationalizing them away. Like, so that's, to them, they're so absolutely certain that materialism is the undoubtable truth that when these genuine doubts come like flaming arrows, they put up their faith shields. That's how they stop it.
Mm-hmm.
They have doubts too. Unbelievers have doubts too, is a way of thinking about it.
That's interesting.
Doubters doubt too. What if you said it like that? There you go. That's it. But then so he gets into the fact that he's kind of pluralist about religion. Meaning what exactly?
Yeah, so he says that he doesn't believe that there's one religion capable of serving the needs of all the various types of people or personalities, and so you have to be open to the idea that there are some religions that suit some people while other religions suit others. And I think that he is right about the point of like it's hard to have one thing work for everyone, but I think like within Christianity you have the idea of the body of Christ, and you have different organs serving different functions in the body of Christ. And so that's something where you've got the religion making allowances for various personality types and giving some freedom in your belief to focus on some areas rather than others. And so it allows for both the healthy minded and the sick souled. It allows for, people who are introverts and people who are extroverts. So it opens up room for the various types of people. So I don't think he necessarily has to be open to multiple religions, but the religions at least have to be able to meet the needs of more than one personality type.
Yeah. And well, I think that's in a sense what he's claiming is that for some reason that can't be true. And it's not just more than one personality type, but more than one like cultural type.
Yeah.
And in a sense, there's something to that. But well, any religion that holds the value of total unity as any religion that holds unity as a value basically can't believe that precisely. So in a sense, the way that I think about it is he's right at one sense in that if there was one religion that did serve everyone's needs in the way that he's saying it, then it would be fit in every environment, and it would have, like an invasive species, just covered the whole globe instantly. But that doesn't mean that the religions that do exist in where they do exist shouldn't still believe themselves to be the one true religion and try to spread in various ways.
Yeah.
Right. So so he's basically saying because of the fact that there are so many different types of people, no religion is going to be an invasive species,
Yeah.
Which is another way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
If that's failure, then Sorry.
Yeah. Although you do have both Christianity and Islam have been pretty invasive in the sense that they've hit multiple continents and multiple cultures pretty well over, this. It's taken a while, but they've been able to hit a large portion of the population. But
Yeah.
again, you still don't have the total capturing of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And his last quote here is, "Rather do I fear to lose truth by this pretension to possess it already wholly." What does that mean? What is this pretension? This pretension. The pretension that something can be encapsulated all in one religion. So he would prefer to not accidentally say, "Oh, we're all going to get things in this one religion," than to actually be able to hold it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then he talks about individual and tribal religion, which he says he's talking about the individual experiences here, at least for the rest of this chapter, which, okay, we gotcha. You said that before. And then, he talks about the loneliness of the beginners of a religion. Yeah. And prophets are always persecuted in their hometown. That's Jesus, right?
That is, yeah.
That feels like it almost feels like an American South. I always associate it with the American South, but it's Jesus.
Yeah.
Maybe the Mormons are right. I don't know. But yeah, and so John the Baptist too, in a sense, he's also partially the originator of Christianity. Moses was alone for a while.
Abraham was. Muhammad was for a while.
Yeah, Muhammad. Buddha. I assume. I don't know much about Buddha.
He talks about that. And so he started off in like a wealthy family, but was like protected from the outside world. Then he gets exposed to the outside world, and he spends a lot of time in solitude after that. He was not necessarily like persecuted, but I don't believe so. But he definitely spent a lot of time in solitude, as did Jesus, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, probably.
Yeah, and in a sense, the Desert Fathers too, like the whole monastic tradition, they like try to emulate this to try and learn things.
Yeah.
Where they destroy, in a sense, I'd say fasting is like tilling your soil. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you want God to work in you, you have to break up the clumps of soil that have built up over the time that you have not been paying attention to it.
Yeah.
So you have to, and by going into the desert, you completely, it's almost like turning yourself back into the dust.
Never thought about it like that.
To be reformed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he does talk about the kind of cycle that develops of you've got a religious originator who is seen as a prophet or as like a founder of a religion, but the people who are involved in the institutional religion in that area at that time will reject them, persecute them, and kind of drive them out of society until that religious originator gains more following. Then they're seen as a heretic, and then after a while their religion becomes orthodox, or the view becomes orthodox, and then instead of getting religious experience from that firsthand way like the prophet did, it then becomes another, like he uses orthodox as in like lowercase o, yeah, not the Eastern Church. But yeah, it becomes orthodox, and then that cycle kind of repeats itself.
Yeah. And which he almost puts he clearly wants like genuinity really strongly, and he doesn't want anything to get too tight and too much, to the sense that, because this is very much like his idea that a new figure will come along and add something to the pile, and then the pile that they've created with what they've added is now rejecting new things that could be added to the pile, or new things
Yeah.
that could be changed. And I think he's very resistant to that. But unless the way that they live builds a pile that is designed precisely to accept things and to keep the spark alive.
Yeah.
So what is this that he says here? The baseness so commonly charged to religion's account are thus, almost all of them not chargeable at all to religion proper, but rather to religion's wicked practical partner, the spirit of corporate dominion. And the bigotries are most of them in their turn chargeable to religion's wicked intellectual partner, the spirit of dogmatic dominion, the passion for laying down the law in the form of an absolutely closed-in theoretic system. Yeah, and I think he's definitely thinking of the Catholic Church here.
Yeah.
And their own experiences with that. And the closed-inness of the Catholic Church, I think, naturally led to the reaction that was the Protestant Church. And how was that reaction going to go is a different story, but
yeah,
that's how it went.
I think this goes back to a discussion that we were having earlier about the parable of the sower, the parable of the tares. And so what he wants is more fertile ground, more ground that allows you to grow new ideas, and so you can see development, and so you don't become like outdated or closed-minded, and you can't develop new theological ideas or whatever. But then you also, when you're too open with your ideas, you let tares grow as well, and you run that risk. And so you have to work out, how do you adapt, change, and learn while also not letting in heresies. And so that's something like in the Orthodox Church, you have councils that will make rulings on heresies, but you still also have an emphasis on the mysteries. And so you understand that you don't know everything and that you can still be learning even 2,000 years later. And so it's that balance between letting new things in, but also not letting in things that you shouldn't be letting in.
Yeah. And in a sense, and Protestants have their own closed-in theoretic system, but they just call it the Bible. And just the mere fact even that Protestants have no prophetic tradition, or certain Protestant churches or were so resistant to prophetic traditions because it often disturbed their own interpretations of the scripture.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because, but they didn't. That's the idea of cessationism, that after the apostles, basically there were no more spiritual gifts that people had.
Yeah.
And basically you just have the Bible until Jesus comes back. And that had its own, in a sense, reaction. So I'd say that Pentecostalism is in a way like the Protestant Reformation to the Protestants of the Protestants in a way, because they broke off and they went strong with the Holy Spirit is guiding us this way, that way. But
they broke away against they broke away against the cessationists, and so now you've still got that open system, but then they might have gone too far in that direction. And so I think a Protestant denomination is more likely to be a closed off system, but when new ideas start forming within it, you just have a new denomination break away from it or start to develop. And so like Catholic or Orthodox churches have to like encapsulate all the various ideas within them, whereas Protestant churches are more likely to break off and splinter into new denominations or sub-denominations.
And I was reading something on Catholic canon law versus Orthodox canon law, and the way that they do it is very much, the Orthodox see it as a tradition where they refer back to old things. What did they do in that situation? And they keep referring to it that way. Whereas the Catholic Church is very much more like we're just going to look at it and like figure it out, because we've got the philosophy side and we've got the scripture side and we've got the tradition side, but they're kind of like three sources that end up in what they do. Whereas the Orthodox Church is like, we're a body that moves forward in time and refers back to old things, but also sometimes does somewhat new things, and we adapt. It's more about adaptation than it is about apodictic certainty in a way.
Yeah. So would you think of like Catholic canon law as being more like civil law, whereas Orthodox being more like common law?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I
That
would.
makes sense.
I don't know enough about those differences though, and that it's something I want to study.
Okay.
So if anybody has anything on that. Okay, now he starts to actually talk about the saints.
Yeah.
And he says saints can be, clearly in the last chapter he spent a lot of time describing different qualities that often come along with saintly life. And now he's saying sometimes those things can be a little bit overboard.
Yeah.
And so like fasting or something, for example, you can fast to the point that you die. Like there was a story that I remember reading as a kid for Armenian class when my mom was teaching me, and it was about like an old woman and a child who were supposed to be fasting for Lent, and the old woman just like basically made the child like die of thirst because of the fasting. And so, if she had asked the priest would probably say like, no, you're missing the point of fasting, right? You're killing the child. And but so she kind of didn't understand the point of fasting and ended up going overboard with it, going to the fanatic end of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he sees one of the sources of the extravagances or the fanaticism would be like lack of intellect. Oh wow, lack of intellect, or not having an open mind. So kind of having a closed down system and just focusing on one thing without having a broader intellectual system to encompass other things. And so talks about fanaticism. So that's like the vice associated with excess devotion is when you're a fanatic, and so you get narrow-minded or closed in about one thing, and you lose any kind of association with the rest of the world. And he has one story about a Muslim, I think it was Sunni, and their big guy is Ali, like the son-in-law of Muhammad. I might not be right, but anyway.
Yeah, their split is over who was the primary like inheritor of Muhammad's rule. Yeah. Brother-in-law or the son-in-law. I don't know which one was which, but
yeah, I'm trying to find it now. But anyway, this guy just will only say the name Ali his entire life, and so that's what he does. Okay, here we go. It's the Shiites venerate Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, instead of Abu Bakr, the brother-in-law. So the son-in-law Ali is venerated by the Shiites, and so the Shiite guy would only say the name Ali, and that's what he did for like his entire life. Was only said that, well, not his entire life, but his life from a certain point, and he would walk around and just scream the name and throw sticks in the air. And so he lost all kind of normalcy or any kind of ability to live a life or to provide positive impact on people's life because he was dead set on just like saying this guy's name. And so it can also, like, fanaticism can also lead to cruelty or persecution of others. And so he talks about like Luther was okay with the persecution of the Anabaptists. You'd have, all throughout religious history, you have people who are religious fanatics, or their devotion leads to a lack of mercy, or leads them to violence against people of other religions or religious sects. And so that would be a like a extravagance of a saintly virtue where being devoted to a religion is good, but leading to a fanaticism that doesn't allow you to like provide good in people's lives or leads you to violence against others?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a case where, this saintly virtue is actually not providing any kind of goodness? And he also talks about that fanaticism can also play into what he calls theopathic love, which is where you're so captivated by God's love that you are unable to have like any kind of relationship with anyone on earth. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a story about this lady, Margaret Mary, who was like so consumed by her feeling of Christ's love that she couldn't do her chores in the convent that she was in. She was unable to like cut vegetables, to cook meals, to help people. And
Mm-hmm.
so all she could do was talk about how much love she felt from God, but that was all she was capable of doing. And everything else was just, she couldn't help anyone, and she became a burden to a lot of people. And so
But
it's
it's
not,
possible he's kind of like, when I was reading that, I was like, okay, well, he's kind of ignoring the fact she bore little fruit for herself if she was trying to like support herself, but that's kind of the point of the convent in a way. In a way, the convent was like a thing to protect her.
yeah,
Right? And now a doubter could read that and go, either she was crazy or she was just manipulating everybody, right?
yeah,
But clear, I mean, in a sense, if the church works a little bit more like a body, then her excess was counteracted by other people's charity towards her. And it's, in a sense, it's like a division of spiritual labor.
yeah. And so it kind of plays into something you said a little earlier about how like these the extravagances can be things that you don't want to imitate yourself, but they like still provide some kind of good. And so like she might have been doing something that she was supposed to be doing, but it's not necessarily something that it would be good for everyone to be
Of course, yeah.
imitating or doing. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's possible that he's interpreting all religions through a Protestant one-style relationship lens, where it's just your relationship with God is what the religion is.
Yeah.
Um, and there's no mediate relationships like through the body of the church. Now, the corporate forms of Christianity don't discourage direct relationships with Christ, but they encourage both relationships with Christ directly and mediated relationships through corporate worship.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit different. So,
mm-hmm.
Very cool. And then this is where he has that other Luther quote.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's not a Luther quote, but it's a quote about Luther.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, one of the He goes,
good quotes about Luther.
Yeah. When Luther, in his immense manly way, swept off by a stroke of his hand the very notion of a debit and credit account kept with individuals by the Almighty, he stretched the soul's imagination and saved theology from puerility. Puerility meaning like childishness. Mm-hmm. So, okay, if you think so. Yeah. And then he talks about excessive purity. You can accidentally just leave the world. And you can, and he says he like a guy vows to be a virgin for life, and he took every step to avoid temptation, never looked at women at all. He would only talk about Jesus, which it's kind of the same thing as with the last girl. Mm-hmm. You know, like, yeah, I know, like, he wouldn't be able to survive on his own, but maybe he was doing something that was spiritually good for other people, or just like socially, like having him around this kind of force is motivating to other people, and having that and supporting that might be a good thing. Certainly not in every case, and certainly not to excess, but the simple fact that he's not able to feed himself, or like he might be kind of awkward, is not like, I don't even know if that's necessarily a bad thing all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was like unable to be in the same room of like with his mother alone. So it's like it's getting in the way of other like virtues of honoring your father and mother.
Sure.
And so there's definitely some downsides to what he's doing, but he can also be setting an example for others to emulate him in a certain degree so that they take steps to like retain like remain pure. And so can be acting as like a good guide even if it's not like something that you want to emulate perfectly, what like shot for shot what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of reminded me like the way that the excess purity kind of manifests itself is like um, Peterson's description of the known and the unknown. And so their realm of the known is something that they know that they can avoid sin and temptation. And so they're afraid to venture outside of the walled garden or Eden or whatever because they are afraid of what they'll encounter there. The encounters with the unknown could lead to evil. And so they box themselves into their known. And so staying within that known realm is safe, but it can be like unstable or open itself up to new vices. Like snakes get inside the walled garden. It's kind of Peterson's thing. So I think
Yeah.
their effort to remain pure or to retain their purity produces like a very strict control over everything that they do. But there are still ways where that can actually lead to other forms of evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's really it's good that it's a balancing act, right?
Yeah,
Whereas somebody else could take the thing, oh, why would you reject those kind of things, right?
yeah,
Why would you have any of this stuff? That's not the way that he takes it.
yeah,
It just goes, it can clearly go overboard. And it's a balancing thing. And another thing I wanted to mention was in Smith, right? From reading something, Dr. Klein mentioned one time that whenever he uses the words fanaticism and superstition, Smith, at the time, what that meant was fanaticism was what they called the excesses of Protestant theologies, and superstition is what they called the excesses of Catholic theology.
Oh, really?
So, a superstitious, like, old woman who's always carrying like a statue of Mary around and touching everything with it and blessing everything and doing this, and you would call her superstitious. And somebody who's like always yelling in the streets about how your soul is damned and you need to save it, that's a fanatic.
Yeah,
So those are not bad things directly, but on balance they are.
yeah,
Yeah. And so Smith knew about it. Smith and is all on board with this.
yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
By and large, yeah,
By and large, yeah.
yeah,
And then he talks about excessive charity, and we just have a quote here. The way in which facts and ideals are interwoven. That perfect conduct is a relationship between three terms: the actor, the objects for which he acts, and the recipients of the action. In order that conduct should be abstractly perfect, all three terms, intention, execution, and reception, should be suited to one another. I think that's straight out of like TMS, actually. The
yeah,
part 2 of TMS. That's like, it's like almost like right in there. So
yeah,
it's awesome. It's awesome.
yeah. But it's just warning against the excesses of like giving charity in cases where you're actually like allowing for more evil to happen and you're not like standing up for yourself or others because you're trying to be too charitable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, this next section was called "The Perfect Man is Adapted Only to the Perfect Environment." And I think that was in some sense related to some of the stuff from earlier. Trust in, so he says, trust and mercy are good virtues, but are not always appropriate. They can make it easier for others to commit evil. Yeah, so you've got to watch yourself when you're trusting someone, or you're going to watch yourself when you love your enemies, because they are your enemies, by the way, and they are trying to get you, right? You don't want to, it's not simply roll over, but it is, if it's a tit for tat game, like cooperate, maybe sometimes, even if they don't deserve it, let's say.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean like just become weak.
Yeah. Don't just become something that like enables others, even if others are doing bad things, they're destroying themselves or others. So you have to be careful in how you're charitable or how you're trusting or merciful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And then this next section kind of hits it's saints or leavens, and so it kind of hits the idea that you're talking about earlier, the balancing act, and like the guy who's like unable to like look at people because he's trying to remain pure. They act as like leavens, where they, even though what they're doing is not necessarily what you want to be doing, they're creating an ideal that kind of spurs other people to action. That's the saintly virtues, except without the excess necessarily. It's the same thing with like the person who loves their enemy regardless of whatever the consequence, and spur other people to love their enemies more than they would have otherwise. And so it can create new like cultures or attitudes in a society, so that you progress morally, and you need these people who are at the extreme end to drive the masses to act in a more pure, saintly way.
Yeah, like they're the people. That's what it means to push the envelope.
Yeah.
And I think in a sense he gets further into later that saints are kind of like people. There are political saints, and there are scientific saints and intellectual philosophical saints, people that are pushing for other people to kind of do the work after them and keep what they thought alive, right?
Yeah. He's
And
got good.
people who have, one time I described it like this: there's people who have original ideas, and then there's people who preserve the original ideas and combine them together. So like, for example, Hayek and Buchanan relatively had like original ideas, if you want to say it that way. And one of the things that Betke does is mix the ideas of Hayek and Buchanan and keeps them alive through students.
Yeah. And so James had this quote: momentarily considered, then the saints may waste his tenderness, or the saint may waste his tenderness and be a dupe and a victim of his charitable fever. But the general function of his charity is social evolution, is vital and essential. If things are ever to move upwards, someone must be ready to take the first step and assume the risk of it. So someone's got to take that first step. Someone's got to be a Hayek or a Buchanan, an econ, or be an Augustine in the church, and then other people follow and emulate and improve or combine different people that they're supposed to follow who are saintly.
Yeah, like Aquinas or something, you could say he dared to read Aristotle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that I'm really excited to when I get to the Great Men and Their Environment essay for the Will to Believe series, because that's, I think the stuff in that essay is exactly what he's talking about here, like exactly. So yeah, I'm very excited for that. And I want to kind of merge that essay into economic history, because that's the only essay. I think that essay kind of solves the McCloskey North problem. But I'm gonna be writing about that soon, and I've got like half a thing written that I don't like what I've written, so I'm gonna redo it and whatever. Yeah. He talks about examples of asceticism, like just denying yourself any kind of pleasure, but that's not a good idea either. And Augustine says, if you only love God enough, you may safely follow all your inclinations, which, yeah, true, but when do you know if you loved God enough? So you gotta watch out. Again, I gotta watch out. It's a balancing act. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess what James was trying to get at is when you're practicing extreme asceticism, you're still granting a lot of power to the flesh, right? You're still saying the flesh is something that has power over you and you're still trying to master it. Whereas, Augustine is talking about how once you've had that development of a relationship with God, you can still let in like worldly pleasures without them becoming temptations. And so you have to guard yourself to make sure that you don't give in to temptation, or you're not exposing yourself to too much temptation, but you also don't want to be like mortifying yourself or like doing asceticism in an extreme manner for your entire life and missing out on like good things that God's provided in the world.
Or
it's a balancing act again.
Give in to temptation. So there's that. That's an option.
There's always that option.
Yeah. Don't forget, there is always that option. Okay. And then he starts talking about the stuff that totally shocked me, because I did not realize that this was in here, where he starts talking about, he uses the phrase, the moral equivalent of war. Now, have you read that?
No, I've heard you talk about it, and Klein's talked about it as well.
Yeah, because that's probably, I said before that Will to Believe is James' most famous essay, but the moral equivalent to war is probably actually his more famous essay, which is, it's very simply just military endeavors are clearly, this is like summing up this section too, is military endeavors are like a secular version of discipline and sacrifice, and he calls them the martial virtues, right? Where you build yourself up and you become stronger and able to deal with problems and are defended, like simply at like that you think the things on the inside that you're defending are worthwhile. So war becomes this great thing that you dedicate yourself to, at least defensive war, and depending which tradition you're in. Offensive war can be its own religion, right? Mm-hmm. Like in the Vikings raiding and stuff like that, but or the Mongols, and but clearly there are downsides to war too in certain dimensions. So what he calls the moral equivalent to war is something that serves those needs of security and strength without being, war. So he says in the essay, he gives like this, which is where people attribute him to the left and the progressive movement. He says like, oh, we should have like a civil service, and everybody, instead of getting drafted into the military, gets drafted into like cleaning up parks, and then and he's very like socialist in the essay in some ways, and he's very socialist in the essay, and which sucks, but like the forestry service during the New Deal, they were like, that was like the inspiration for a lot of those New Deal programs were just to like get people outside working, doing things. Mm-hmm. We're like, yeah, we'll all unite together around like saving the economy, and we'll give people like jobs to just like cut down trees for no good reason.
Yeah. And then you've got war on poverty and war on drugs, which are things that are trying to.
That's exactly what those are. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean they always work.
No.
And so when I first read the essay, I did think it was great, and I was like, yeah, like people should like feel like their life is something worth building discipline to do. It just doesn't need to be war. And I think people don't see their own lives as something where they're fighting or doing something important.
Yeah, and I think that's where people like Peterson or Jocko Willink were able to like rise to prominence now. Peterson is teaching, clean up your room, like discipline yourself, make sacrifices. Your life has meaning when you are willing to make sacrifices, and take on responsibility. And then Jocko's big thing is like discipline equals freedom. You want to be like disciplining yourself more. And so I think these people who are becoming more prominent now through this message of like personal discipline or sacrifice or responsibility are trying to fill that gap that you have of like having that equivalent to war or militarism without actually being in combat or going off to war, because you have that void that needs to be filled somehow. And so they're trying to fill that in a way that's not religion, but also not killing people.
Peterson's is not religion though.
No, it's not religion, but it's also not necessarily religion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which was I think a good thing.
Yeah.
Because it made people pay attention to him, and it didn't make people get tribal.
Yeah.
Which is why the other IDW figures they came up with the phrase Jesus smuggling, which is where you have all these things that seem like good things, and then all of a sudden somebody's talking about Jesus, and you're like, oh, how's that related?
Yeah.
And that's what they accused Jordan of, where he'll say all these things like that are just common sense, right? And then he'll start talking about how Jesus is related to it, and then they'll go, whoa, we're not right.
How'd that happen? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So he goes, yeah, there's pros and cons to being a saint. Obviously, they see life as a moral equivalent to war. They have these other moral equivalents to war that they're able to push, and they're good things, but they can go into excesses and they can just become crazy eccentrics too.
Yeah.
Which is a thing we gotta
watch out for. Yeah.
Yeah, watch out for. And then he starts to talk about Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, I did not know that James had any thing on Nietzsche. I wasn't aware that he was even aware of Nietzsche, which is very interesting because different people like Richard Rorty called William James the Nietzsche of America.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's a very weird kind of thing because their views on religion were obviously very different. But then again, Richard Rorty really downplayed William James' views on religion. He thought it was one of the lesser parts of James. So
just has a 500-page book on it. That's
he just goes, oh well, I don't really care about that.
Care about that.
Well, I don't know that much about Rorty, but Rorty didn't grow up religious, so I don't think it impressed him at all.
Maybe.
But so Nietzsche is against saintliness, or he's against these people that self-effacing, which we don't need to get into Nietzsche's philosophy, but he's against the kind of self-effacing, denying, he might call it body despising philosophies or something like that. And so he's much more in favor of someone being a big strong man or something like that. But James says strong men are needed and saints are needed. But what's important that James doesn't talk too much about, because he's kind of skimming over the relationships between these people, the social ties that make the saints and strong men needed, the saints and the strong, that in a sense the priests and the knights. But how do they get involved with one another and not just trample over each other, right?
Yeah.
How is it that strong men aren't living in strongman world and trample the priests, and the priests are actually given the strength to influence the strongmen?
Yeah.
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 And then he starts talking about, there's no way to understand the idea of an ideal person without the context of a social function. So I've been thinking recently about identity, and identity, essentially, it's a question of what, if you don't know what you are, you don't know where you are in the world of action, right?
Can you expand on that?
So I can say something like, I'm here in this chair, that's part of my identity, but I can also say I'm the owner of this computer or something like that, and that defines my relationship to the computer. So, and then you can say I'm a brother, and I'm a son, and I'm a friend, and I'm a this, and I'm a that. And if those identities have relationships to each other, and they kind of define what makes me an ideal this, that, and the other, right?
Yeah.
So individual being the ideal of each individual is determined by their identity, which is determined by their social relationships. So,
Okay.
and you essentially can't escape your identity, even if you go live on your own, because you're related to God in some way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's very, so he does bring in the social stuff here.
Yeah.
But he doesn't go too into it, and he admits that that's not his focus. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now, when he says here, the abstractly the saint is the highest type, but in the present environment it may fail, so we make ourselves saints at our peril. That is exactly, and he starts talking about St. Paul here. He says, from the biological point of view, St. Paul was a failure because he was beheaded. Yet he was magnificently adapted to the larger environment of history, which is, so the Darwinian stuff is really cool here in that he's going, in a sense, he's saying, what are people's actions? What are their characteristics? And then what is the final environment against which things are tested? And the final environment is the final judgment, because if God is the director of the environment.
Yeah.
And but then he talks about St. Paul, and this reminds me of St. Paul's things on marriage, where he says, yeah, the ideal type is one who's just totally in communion with God and is not given into carnal pleasures. But if you cannot resist, the married life is probably better for you. This does not mean you're better, that a monk is better than you, but you have to adapt to your environment, and you do the best you can in the environment. And if the church was only monks, it would only last a generation.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. So you've got this balancing act between different roles and different environments, and so that's why you have a lot of stuff in like First and Second Corinthians. There are multiple places where Paul goes, "This is like advice. This is how I live my life, but this is not necessarily what you have to do." And that's like the openness of his understanding that like you're reaching out to a variety of people and a variety of cultures, and so you have to be able to like provide something that serves as a good guide, but is not necessarily always the case that you're following.
so Paul took James' advice in a sense when he was spreading Christianity.
Yeah, or James copied down Paul's advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but he doesn't say that. He doesn't really say it explicitly. He might have. Well,
yeah.
He could say a lot of things that he doesn't say.
Yeah.
But yeah. There's one thing that I learned recently that I thought was interesting was I was listening to something that Abbot Trifon was saying, and he said that if you contrast Alaskan native Christians with native Christians in the lower 48 states, the Alaskan natives became Orthodox because the Russians were the first ones to go to Alaska.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this was just like from a cursory thing, but they see Christianity as a fulfillment of their religion.
Okay.
Of their tribal religion, whereas the ones in the lower 48, where the other Christians came along and said, "Oh, those gods you worship, they're not real. This is the real God. His name is Jesus." Mm-hmm. Whereas the further one, the older ones saw Christianity as almost prophesied in their own religion.
Really? That's pretty cool.
So I don't know. Yeah, in a sense, that is what the faith is that Christ is the key to all of those locks.
Yeah.
But if you throw out the lock, then maybe the key worked. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if, like in Canada, if you look from Western Canada to Eastern Canada, if you see a shift.
I don't think the Russians got that far, though.
Maybe.
The Russians were really only in Alaska.
Yeah.
So,
because
and again, I don't know much about that, so that's something I'd want to look into.
Yeah.
Other way, yeah. And then he ends with, "If a religion is true, its fruits will be good."
Yeah.
Plain and simple. Well, that was a good one. That was probably pretty long. I haven't been keeping track of time, but that was probably pretty long. Probably the longest one so far.
Yeah.
But the next chapter is the longest chapter so far. So there's a slight chance maybe we'll split it up into 2 videos, but I don't. We'll just blast through it. There's nothing else to do.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.